Today I'm going to be doing a demonstration using Inktense blocks and pencils of these pumpkins. Hi, I'm Lisa, the artist behind Lachri Fine Art. Today I'm working in Inktense, and if you've not already seen my initial review of this product, make sure to head over and check that out. I'll have a card pop up here so you can see how I thinned down my Inktense blocks into almost a watercolor-like mixture so that I can apply the ink directly to the paper, and that gives me a really smooth look. Now, just to be clear, Inktense is not watercolor. They are two completely separate mediums. With Inktense, once it's dry, it's permanent, so it's not going to re-lift when you apply your next color, which is great if you like to glaze like I do. It's almost like taking the best of acrylic and combining it with the best parts of watercolor into one medium that just works really well for me. Just for transparency, Derwent did provide me with the pencils and the blocks that I'm using in this video, but it is not a sponsored video. If you are supporters over on Patreon, make sure to head over where the 1.5-hour version of this tutorial is available for you now, so make sure to head over and check that out. If you're unfamiliar with Patreon, for as little as $4 a month, you get access to each of my weekly 1 to 2 hour long tutorials, ranging from colored pencil, acrylics, sometimes it's oil painting, lots of different mediums I work in for the tutorials there. I have over 100 there for you to watch now, so that's a lot of tutorials for $4. Now that I'm done with that self-promotion, let's move on to this demonstration. I started by drawing everything out with a water-soluble graphite pencil. That way I don't have any graphite lines showing through my Inktense. I'm using the Inktense blocks here, and I've mixed water in with them in a separate palette. So I created this ink that I've mixed lots of water with to make translucent and make it flow very nicely. And now I'm just using a Taklon bristled filbert brush, I can't talk, to paint in my base layers. Now I'm going to build this up till it gets dark enough. It's not going to start out super dark, being that I am using so much water. The more water you mix in with your blocks or your pencils, the more translucent or lighter the color is going to look on your paper. So I'm just going to build this up slowly, layer after layer. I'm drying it with a hairdryer before I go on to my next layer. This time I've used more black in with my color. The first time was a brownish tone. And I'm using a mop brush just to get rid of some of my brush strokes. I'm okay with some being there, but I do want to soften a few out that are really harsh. That's that fluffy brush that you're seeing there. Going to dry that with a hairdryer, and I'm working on Fabriano Artistico Extra White Hot Pressed 140-pound watercolor paper. And this paper will dry back completely flat when I use the hairdryer on it like this. That's why I've got it taped down along the edges so that it holds that shape. Now I'm going to create some creases in the curtains that are behind these pumpkins. Just some vertical lines there. I want to get variation. I don't want it to necessarily look just like stripes. I just want some shadows so that it looks like that fabric is waving in and out. Going to dry that layer. Now the camera that I'm using, between the camera and the lights that are on this, they're really harsh and it washes this out really badly. This is actually a lot darker than what it looks like in this photo by this stage. When I take this into natural lighting, and you'll see that when I show my finished painting, it is so much darker than what you're seeing here. It's just the way that these lights are bouncing off the paper. It looks a lot lighter than it really is. A lot more faded. Now these colors will look a lot lighter as they dry. When you first put them down, when they're very wet, they look really dark, really deep saturation. Once it dries, it's going to get a lot lighter. That's normal. I'm just going to layer and layer until I get them dark enough. Going to start laying my shadows in here on the base. Now the way that I like to work with Inktense, I like to line a lot of things out first, get my details in the wood grain or whatever it is that I'm painting, and then I will glaze, put very translucent layers on top of those details. You'll still see the shadows underneath, and I can come back through and darken them up as needed later on. But I find that it makes it a lot easier for me with this to just line in most of the major shadows first. Getting all these details in there, and then when that dries completely, I can go over it with my brown tones for the wood grain. Getting some of the shadows lined in for the pumpkins and around the butterfly. I'm using a Simply Simmons round brush for this section. There is my finished painting, and you can see here how much darker and how much more bold those curtains, that background is, than what you're seeing here. This lighting, I had a really hard time getting photos when I was taking shots for Instagram. When taking it under this light, it just washed it out so badly. It looks much better in natural lighting. Adding some more wood grain there, just sketching it back and forth. Cleaning up that background because I did not come down quite far enough for that area. My shadows are going to be really bold on this one. Now this piece, I didn't actually add that much detail, and it's funny because a lot of people said it looked more realistic than some of my other work, and that isn't because of detail, it's because of my shadows, because of the light lights and the dark darks. Your values, how dark your darks are, how light your lights are, those are going to make a huge difference in making your work look more realistic if that's your goal. If you're having a hard time making your work look realistic, let's say you've got everything drawn out great, you've added all this detail, but it still looks kind of cartoony, doesn't have a very realistic look, usually it's your values to blame. You don't have your darks dark enough is more often than not the problem. Sometimes the lights aren't light enough either, but usually it's that people are afraid to get their shadows really dark. But that's what's going to make a very big difference in making your work look more realistic. Don't be afraid to get those shadows in there. And I've got that finished painting in the upper left-hand corner so you can see how much darker this really is than what it's showing on the camera there. And you can see where I'm going with this. So here, I didn't want to just use black for these white pumpkins, so I went with a brown color here and added a decent amount of water so that it'd be fairly translucent. It makes it a lighter brown. More water will give you a more muted color. And then if you, let's say you're using red and the red's just too fluorescent red, add a little bit of green to it, add its complementary color, and you can neutralize that color. The great thing with ink tints, because they blend and mix so well, even if you have a smaller set, if you just want to try them out and see if you like them, if you've got a smaller set, you can mix so many colors from even the small set. They blend and mix really well. Especially, my favorite are the blocks because of the way that you can paint them on. And so far, everything I've done here is with the Inktense blocks. I really don't use the pencils too much until I get to my final layers on this one. Starting to build up some of the shadows on these pumpkins over here. See how I'm going very light. If you look at my finished painting, you can see I'm going to end up getting really dark on those back shadows, but it's easier and a lot less scary if you start out slowly building up. Don't jump to your darkest values right off the bat, because if you go too dark, it's going to make it a lot more, or make a lot more work for you to go back and try to lighten things up. Very easy to keep going through and making things darker though, like I'm doing here. Let that layer dry, and now I'm adding some more brown over that. Now we'll dry that, and every time I add a lot of water, my paper does warp quite a bit. Once I take the hairdryer to it, it will dry completely, and I am using high heat on that. It's not as close to the paper as it looks on the video. The camera angle makes it look like the hairdryer is touching the paper almost. It's not. It's about a foot away from the paper itself. Now I'm using this gold color and just very loosely creating this mottled look on the pumpkins. My detail is not very sharp. I just want to create that texture, that look that you're seeing, or that I was seeing in my reference photo. For the butterfly, I'm first going to line out my dark areas. I can come back through and darken them up later. I don't need them to be super dark, but I want them kind of sketched in so I know where everything's going to go. And it makes it really easy because then I can take my yellows and my oranges. Once this is dry, I will just wash that yellow and orange right on top of these dark areas. And those colors are so translucent, I'm still going to see all of the detail that I'm adding in here. I just want to make sure that's dry all the way first. Now, in order to clean up my edges where my background was really messy and covered the pumpkins a little bit, what I'm going to do is take my white Inktense block and add water to it. So I make this mixture, and that I make thicker than what I'm painting on the rest of this piece. I make the white a lot thicker, so it's almost like a paste. And then I paint that over anywhere where I covered the background on top of the pumpkin where I don't want the dark areas, like on my white pumpkin on the edge. Those edges are really messy. If I want to clean those up, I'll just add the white Inktense block. Once that dries, it'll dry opaque. When you first put it on, it'll look translucent, like it's not doing anything. Let it dry and it'll be completely opaque. It'll really cover up anything underneath it. If it doesn't cover it all the way, add another layer of the white. Starting to build up some of the color on my pumpkins here. Now for this green, I'm adding a lot of water to it because I don't want it to be too bold. I want a very soft grayish color. Starting to build up the shadows on these guys. Again, notice how I'm not going that dark just yet. If you look at the finished photo, how much darker that's going to need to be, it's a lot safer to slowly build up to that point. Coming through with another layer of this orange color, adding some of that to my butterfly as well. Now the thing that I like about Inktense is it is a very forgiving medium. If you mess something up and you decide you don't like a color that you just added, let it dry and then make that ink mixture with the white, like I was talking about, the white Inktense block along with water, and then paint that over the area that you messed up. And then when that dries, you can paint whatever color you want on top of that. But it's nice because you can change things, you can fix things very easily if something goes terribly wrong. Darkening up this bottom area. I wanted that to be a lot richer. Starting to get some of the colors in the butterfly. Now, if you look at where I had previously painted the black, it's a little bit dull right now. It's not super dark. I will come back through once this dries and really make those colors, the black, the dark detailing around the butterfly, a lot more bold. The thing that I like so much about Inktense, it is such a fast medium to work in. This whole project, I probably spent 2 hours on. You can get a lot of coverage very, very quickly. So if you're wanting to create stuff like illustrations in a book, this would be perfect for, or anything where you're on a bit of a time crunch, really, really good. And I do like the work that it produces, even if you want to make prints like I will of this. Using a round brush to get some of the detailing on the butterfly. Now I'll start getting these rich, deep, dark colors in there. And you can do all of this with the pencils as well. Next week's video, I'm going to show you a project done just with Inktense pencils for the dolphin, the tin of the new Inktense pencil line. Well, not the new line, that's worded wrong. The new tins for the already existing Inktense line. Using a liner brush to get some of the smaller details, and that is a synthetic hog hair #1 liner brush. And I'm going back and forth between making actual lines and then little dots for some of these areas. Some of the tiny details are nothing more than dots. And remember, these are going to be a bit more dull when they dry. So you may want to do a couple of layers to get them really bold. And I do recommend using a decent watercolor paper for these. This one is a hot press watercolor paper, so it's very smooth, easy to get tiny, tiny detail. But if you're going to use a lot of water with them like I do, you want to go with a watercolor paper, something that's intended to handle that much water. I wouldn't use Stonehenge or something like that, something that's not really intended for the amount of water that you'll use with these. Using that liner brush for just tiny little details here and there. Using some white to get my edges. You can get so much detail with the Inktense blocks if you're using paintbrushes like this. You look at them initially and think they're huge. You're not going to get little detail. I can get smaller detail with my Inktense blocks and a liner brush than I can with the Inktense pencils themselves. You've got a bit more control there. Very flexible medium on how many different techniques you can use to get different results. Now, areas that I wanted blue, I first painted with the white and let that dry. That way I didn't just turn to green because of painting blue over the yellow. Adding a little bit of this reddish magenta color through this. Now I decided later on that was a bit too much magenta for this piece because there wasn't that, I really didn't have that color anywhere else. So I came back later on, covered some of it with white, and then went over it with the oranges and yellows to make it fit better. So this is where it goes back to what I was talking about before, where it really is very flexible. You can change your mind, you can change colors. It's really easy to fix things. The white Inktense block I go through more than any other color because I use it as a correction tool, basically. Because I add the white over the wings. When you first add it, it doesn't look like anything happened. Let it dry and it will become more and more opaque as it dries. Using the white here to pull out some highlights and just create a bit more texture on that pumpkin. And if it ends up being too white, it's no big deal. I can just tone it down by glazing another color on top. So it's actually kind of difficult to really mess something up that you can't fix with these. So these shadows, they look like they're way too dark, but once they dry, they'll lighten up, so they are not going to be quite that harsh. But I do want very, very defined shadows on this one. Starting to darken these guys up a bit more, adding this deeper orangey brown color. I'm just making up terms. Orangey brown is not actually the name of any of these colors as far as I know. And see how I'm taking that white again and just cleaning up the edges, defining things. I'm not going to leave that outer edge lined with white. I'll put another color over it, but by putting the white first, it's going to let whatever color I put on top show really well against the dark. Now, so often you'll be working on something and think that you just can't get your lights light enough. More often than not, I think that it's not an issue so much of your lights aren't light enough. Usually, it's that your darks aren't dark enough. If the dark color next to the light color is not dark enough, the light won't appear as bright as it could. So making sure to get your shadows dark enough is very important in making your light areas look light enough. Now I'm starting to work with the pencils, and I went ahead and added the shadow there in the black, and the black pencil, when you go over that with the water, will get really, really dark. Gives you a very nice, rich color. You can add some details there, and with the pencils or with the blocks, remember when you apply them directly to the paper and then add water on top, sometimes if you don't activate all of it, you don't blend it out really well with water, when you go on top with your next layer, that first layer may reactivate again. And that's a complaint that I've heard people say, well, they're not really permanent because when I went on top of it with the next color, the first color lifted off. Usually that has to do with not having fully blended out the first layer when you applied the pencils. Using the white pencil here just to get some highlights. This won't be quite as opaque or quite as bright as what I will get with the Inktense block and water mixture by painting it on, but it still, you can see, really does show up fairly well. Getting some shadows in between there and using the brush on top of it to blend it out. And I do recommend every time you try a color out, try it on a scratch piece of paper before you try it out on your project. Because sometimes what the pencil looks like dry, once you add water to it, it's going to look completely different. So make sure you make color swatches with these so you have a better idea of what the actual color will be once the water is applied. And the amount of water that you apply will make a big difference too. Going back through with the pencil and defining some of the detail and shadows a bit more. And this is the stage where I just go around the edges and clean things up. My first layers with Inktense are usually really messy, where I'm not staying inside the line well. Nothing's very crisp. My shadows aren't perfect. Everything's just kind of a mess. What I do is as I build up each additional layer, I tighten things up a little bit more, and then a little bit more on the next layer, and a little bit more on the next layer. And I just keep repeating that until I get the detailing that I want and the nice crisp edges. But it's very easy when you do your first layers to think, oh, this is a mess. The edges aren't clean. You can clean that up as you go. Just keep layering and building until you get it to look how you want it to. But don't get frustrated earlier on thinking you're having a hard time controlling how much water to use or anything like that. You've got to play around with them and you've got to practice with them. But it's, like I was saying before, very, very hard to make a mistake that you can't fix. Just keep layering until it looks right. And take advantage of that white Inktense block, mixing it with water and painting that on anywhere where you had a mistake, where you need to clean up an edge or fix anything, because you can paint other colors on top of it when it dries. And I love these pencils for these final details in here. The white pencil, when you add water to that, it won't be quite as opaque as making the separate mixture with the Inktense block and applying it with a paintbrush, but you still can see it. It still does show up really nice when you're just getting slight, more subtle highlights. It's really good for those. And that is it for this piece. And as you can see here, look how light it is. When I get this one into natural daylight, this is a much more accurate photo of what the piece looks like in person. For some reason, my lighting was just washing that out like crazy. But that is it for this one, and I will be showing you how I painted the dolphin tins, or the dolphin that's on the new tins, next week. I think you'll be seeing me work in Inktense a lot more often. I don't know why I haven't worked in it in so long. It's one of the most enjoyable. I have so much fun every time I paint in these. So yeah, I'm pretty sure you're going to be seeing me work in this more often than what you have been lately. Have you subscribed yet? If not, I have a handy button right there. It's round, has an orange arrow going to it. If you click on that, that'll help you to keep up to date with all of my new art videos every single week. My second time recording this video because I forgot to record the audio for the first one. That probably would have made some people happy, but also wouldn't have been too useful.